3 prototypes, that's all that was ever built. A jet so fast, so sharp, so far ahead of its rivals that test pilots nicknamed it the Maneater, because they were terrified it would eat them alive if they had to eject. The Air Force killed it anyway. Then, over the jungles of North Vietnam, nearly 400 of its replacement went down in flames. This is the story of the fighter America should have built, and the one that was allowed to fly instead. Part 1. The Skies over Korea, where the lesson was written in fire. Picture it. 30,000 feet above the Yalu River. Sometime in the early 1950s. 2 silver shapes claw through thin, freezing air, closing on each other at a combined speed of over 1,000 miles an hour. One is an American F-106 Sabre, the pride of the U.S. Air Force. The other is a Soviet-built MiG-15, flown officially by North Korean or Chinese pilots, but everyone on both sides knew the truth. Behind that MiG's controls, more often than anyone in Washington wanted to admit, sat a Soviet pilot. This was the first time American and Soviet airmen had ever tried to kill each other directly, and it happened at speeds no one had trained for. The Sabre pilot lines up his shot, thumbs the trigger on his 6.50 caliber machine guns, and unleashes a storm of lead into the MiG's fuselage. Tracers stitch across the enemy jet, and the MiG keeps flying. That was the terrifying discovery of the Korean Air War. The MiG-15 was built like a flying tank, and 50 caliber rounds, the same guns that had ruled the skies over Germany and Japan less than a decade earlier, simply weren't enough anymore. Pilots were emptying entire ammunition belts into enemy aircraft and watching them limp home anyway. Meanwhile, when a MiG's 37mm cannon connected with an American jet, it didn't wound it. It didn't damage it. It removed a wing. The math was brutal, and both sides did it. Bigger guns, bigger explosions, faster jets. Neither Air Force could keep fighting a war where conventional bullets bounced off the enemy. And there was a second, darker lesson buried inside the first. The next war wasn't going to be fought with machine guns at all. It was going to be fought with the bomb. By the time the Korean War ground to its uneasy stalemate, both Washington and Moscow understood something with total clarity. Whoever built the next generation of jets, the ones that could smash through the sound barrier, outrun anything that had come before, and carry a nuclear weapon deep into enemy territory before anyone could stop them, was going to own the next war before it even started. Not the war of dogfights and gun cameras, the war of first strikes, hidden runways, and 15 minutes between takeoff and Armageddon. 2 nations walked away from Korea asking the exact same question: what do we build next? And they arrived at 2 radically different answers. Answers that would decide, a decade later, how many pilots came home from a jungle war that hadn't even started yet. Part 2. 2 philosophies, 1 race. By the late 1950s, the Cold War had a new front line, and it wasn't drawn on any map. It was drawn on drafting tables, in wind tunnels, and in the sleepless nights of aircraft engineers from Ohio to the Ural Mountains. America's approach to this race reflected everything the country believed about itself. Bigger economy, better electronics, smarter systems. U.S. designers reached for complexity. Sophisticated radar sets that could find a target in darkness or storm. Computerized bombing systems. Afterburning engines pushing past Mach 2. Aircraft dense with vacuum tubes and wiring that represented the absolute cutting edge of Western engineering. The philosophy was simple: outthink and out-engineer the enemy. Build a machine so technologically dominant that raw numbers wouldn't matter. 6,000 miles east, in the design bureaus of the Soviet Union, a very different philosophy was taking shape. And nowhere more so than inside the offices of a stubborn, brilliant chief designer named Pavel Sukhoi. Soviet doctrine didn't dream of winning wars through elegance. It dreamed of winning wars through math and mass. Soviet planners assumed correctly that a real war with NATO would be fought from rough forward airstrips, half-built runways carved into farmland, serviced by conscript mechanics, working in freezing mud with basic tools and no time. There would be no pristine air-conditioned hangars. There would be no leisure to nurse a wounded jet back to health with a spare parts catalog and a phone call to the manufacturer. So Sukhoi didn't build his aircraft to be brilliant. He built them to survive being stupid, thick-skinned, massive, over-engineered structural spars, twin cannons that didn't need a computer to aim, engines that could swallow a battlefield's worth of dust, ice and abuse and keep spinning. If an American engineer's nightmare was inefficiency, a Soviet engineer's nightmare was fragility. Two air forces, two philosophies, one preparing to fight a war of precision, the other preparing to fight a war of attrition. And into this fork in the road walked two aircraft that would embody each philosophy perfectly. One of them a machine so radical it terrified the very men flying it, and the other a machine so crude that nobody expected it to matter at all. They were both wrong about which one would win. Part 3. The Maneater at North American Aviation. The same company that had built the legendary F-106 Sabre. Engineers were staring at a problem that seemed, at first glance, unsolvable. Their new jet evolved from the F-100 Super Sabre and eventually designated the F-107 Ultra Sabre. Needed to do two things that fought each other for the exact same real estate on the airframe. First, it needed a massive air intake to feed a monstrous new engine capable of pushing the jet past twice the speed of sound. Second, it needed a large, unobstructed bomb bay under the fuselage, big enough to carry a nuclear weapon flush against the belly of the aircraft. Because that bulky weapon simply would not fit anywhere else without wrecking the jet's aerodynamics. Every conventional fighter on Earth solved the air intake problem the same way. A gaping mouth in the nose, right where the pilot's eyes were pointed, sucking air straight down the center of the fuselage. But that layout devoured the exact space North American needed for the bomb. So somebody at North American made a decision that, on paper, looked almost insane. Take the intake off the nose entirely, move it up over the top of the fuselage, and mount it directly above and behind the cockpit. A single, enormous dorsal scoop straddling the spine of the aircraft like some kind of mechanical shark fin. It was one of the strangest silhouettes ever to leave the ground on American soil, and it solved the problem beautifully. The belly was clear, the bomb bay was open, the engine got all the air it needed, and it worked. When test pilots finally strapped into the F-107 and lit the afterburner, the aircraft came alive in a way few American jets ever had. It hit Mach 2 with room to spare. It handled with a precision and stability that stunned even veteran test pilots used to flying temperamental prototypes. Its range was excellent. Its performance envelope, on every chart North American could produce, made its rivals look sluggish and outdated. But there was a catch. There is always a catch. That dorsal intake, mounted directly behind and above the cockpit, sat in exactly the spot a pilot's head would travel if he had to eject in an emergency. In the split-second violence of an ejection, rockets firing, canopy blasting away, a man in his seat hurtling upward into a 200-mile-an-hour wind stream, that enormous, gaping air intake loomed just inches from a pilot's skull. Engineers insisted the geometry worked, that the seat's trajectory would clear the intake lip safely. The math said it was fine. The men flying the jet were not so sure, and so, in ready rooms and hangars across the test program, a nickname was born, half joking and entirely serious at the same time, the Maneater. A machine that could outfly almost anything else in the sky, and might, in the one moment a pilot needed it most, try to swallow him whole. It's worth sitting with that image for a second. Here was arguably the most advanced fighter-bomber America had ever built, faster and more agile than the plane the Air Force would eventually choose instead, and its own pilots were flying it with a private fear whispered between missions. A fear that had nothing to do with the enemy, and everything to do with the machines strapped to their backs. Only 3 F-107s were ever built. 3, out of a design that many aviation historians now regard as one of the most capable fighter bombers of its generation. And within a few short years, the entire program would be dead. Not because the jet failed in the air, but because of decisions made far away from any runway, in offices where paperwork mattered more than performance charts. Part 4. The Beast That Refused to Die. While North American was wrestling with intakes and ejection geometry, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, Pavel Sukhoi's design bureau was fighting a very different kind of battle, one that began, brutally, in tragedy. The first prototype of what would eventually become the Su-7 crashed during testing, killing the test pilot at the controls. In a Western defense industry, a disaster like that, a fatal crash of a brand new prototype, could sometimes be enough to sink a program entirely, especially one competing against rival bureaus for the same military contracts. Careers ended over less, programs were canceled over less, but the Soviet system, for all its brutal inefficiencies, had one advantage in moments like this. Once the state decided a category of aircraft was needed, the political will to keep building rarely evaporated over a single accident. Sukhoi's team went back to their drawing boards, tore into the wreckage of what had gone wrong, and reworked the design from the ground up. What emerged from that grim rebuilding process was the Su-7B, and it would go on to define an entire generation of Soviet ground attack aviation. The Su-7B was not elegant. It did not carry sophisticated radar. Its delta wing, while excellent for sheer speed in a straight line, drank fuel at a rate that gave it an embarrassingly short combat radius compared to Western equivalents. Pilots joked, only half joking, that the jet's mission planning sometimes felt like an argument with a fuel gauge. On paper, stacked next to the F-107's range, its performance sheet looked almost unimpressive. But paper doesn't win wars, metal does, and the Su-7B was built from a philosophy that Sukhoi's design bureau had absorbed at a cellular level. Nothing about frontline combat is gentle, so build something that doesn't care. Its structure was massively over-engineered by Western standards, with a thick-skinned airframe and heavy-duty landing gear, designed to operate off unprepared dirt strips that would have destroyed a more delicate Western jet in a single landing. Its twin cannons didn't need computer-assisted targeting to be lethal. Its systems were simple enough that a conscript ground crew, working in the mud, with minimal tools and minimal training, could keep it flying mission after mission without waiting weeks for specialized parts from a factory thousands of miles away. And then there was the trait that would define its entire combat legacy, the trait that no design chart could fully capture. The Su-7 could absorb an almost unbelievable amount of punishment and still bring its pilot home. Aircrews who flew it in later conflicts told stories, the kind of stories that become legend inside a squadron, of jets returning to base after soaking up dozens of hits from ground fire and small-caliber anti-aircraft rounds, riddled with holes, trailing fuel or hydraulic fluid, and still landing safely. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't sophisticated. It was, in the truest sense of the word, a survivor. By the time full production wound down, Sukhoi's bureau had built nearly 1/900 of these aircraft, a staggering number for a Cold War fighter bomber, and exported them across the Soviet sphere of influence and beyond. It would go on to see combat in some of the most brutal air wars of the 20th century, in the skies over the Middle East and South Asia, earning a reputation less like a precision instrument and more like a blunt, indestructible hammer that kept swinging, long after more delicate weapons had shattered. Two design philosophies, two aircraft, one had just proven, in the most unglamorous way imaginable, that durability could beat elegance. The other, the machine that terrified its own pilots, but could run circles around almost anything in the sky, was about to be cancelled by the very Air Force that built it. Part 5. The decision that would cost hundreds of lives. Here is where the story turns from a tale of engineering into a tale of institutional failure. The kind of decision that looks reasonable in a boardroom and looks catastrophic, years later, from the cockpit of a burning jet over enemy territory. The U.S. Air Force had two fighter bomber designs competing, at least on paper, for the role of America's next-generation nuclear strike aircraft. North America's F-107 Ultra Sabre, with its terrifying dorsal intake and blistering performance, and Republic Aviation's F-105 Thunderchief, a heavier, more conventional design, with a much larger internal weapons bay. On the surface, the deciding factor sounds almost purely technical. The F-105's larger bomb bay meant it could carry a bigger, more powerful nuclear weapon than the F-107 could accommodate. In an era where American nuclear strategy revolved around a doctrine of overwhelming, decisive first strikes against Soviet targets, that extra payload capacity carried enormous weight in Pentagon planning rooms. Bigger bomb, bigger deterrent, or so the logic went. But raw payload capacity wasn't the only force at work behind that decision, and anyone who has studied the history of American defense procurement knows it rarely is. Republic Aviation, the company behind the F-105, was a major defense contractor with deep relationships across the Air Force procurement apparatus. And there were real political and industrial pressures at play in keeping that company's production lines running and its workforce employed. Defense contracts, then as now, were never purely about which piece of metal flew the fastest. They were about factories, jobs, congressional districts, and long-standing relationships between the Pentagon and the companies it depended on. Whatever the true blend of engineering logic and institutional politics behind the final call, the outcome was clear and irreversible. The F-107 program was canceled after just 3 prototypes. The Ultra Sabre, faster, more agile, arguably more advanced in almost every performance category that didn't involve raw bomb tonnage, was quietly retired to museum storage. The F-105 Thunderchief became the U.S. Air Force's chosen fighter bomber for the coming decade. Nobody in that decision room, in the late 1950s, could have known exactly what kind of war the F-105 would eventually be asked to fight. Nobody was planning for jungle canopies, guerrilla-defended supply lines, and an enemy air force flying small, nimble Soviet-designed interceptors, low and fast through mountain valleys. They were planning for a nuclear first strike against fixed Soviet targets, big, heavy, straight-line missions where the F-105 size and payload made sense. But history doesn't ask permission before it changes the assignment. And a few short years later, that exact aircraft, heavy, fast in a straight line but large, difficult to maneuver in a tight turning fight, and originally designed for an entirely different kind of mission, was sent to fly low-altitude strike missions deep into North Vietnam. The results were catastrophic. North Vietnamese defenses turned out to be a brutal combination the F-105 was never built to survive. Small, wickedly agile MiG interceptors that could turn inside a heavier American jet in a dogfight, and a growing web of surface-to-air missile batteries hidden in the jungle canopy below, waiting for exactly the kind of low, straight, predictable bomb run the F-105's mission profile demanded. Pilots flying the Thud, as crews affectionately and grimly nicknamed the F-105, described flying into some of the most heavily defended airspace in the history of aerial warfare, a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire, surface-to-air missiles rising out of the tree line with no warning, and MiGs diving out of the sun onto aircraft that simply couldn't outturn them. The numbers tell the rest of the story with brutal simplicity. Nearly 400 F-105s, roughly half the entire production run of the aircraft, were shot down over the skies of Vietnam. Behind every one of those losses was a pilot, a family, a name that ended up etched somewhere far from home. The losses became so severe, so unsustainable, that the Air Force was eventually forced to withdraw the F-105 from the most dangerous strike missions altogether, shifting many of its remaining airframes to less exposed roles for the remainder of the war. An aircraft chosen, in part, for its ability to carry a bigger nuclear bomb toward a Soviet target that never came, ended up instead fighting a low-altitude guerrilla air war it was never designed for, and it paid for that mismatch in the blood of its own pilots. Part 6. The machine that won by refusing to break. While American pilots were struggling to bring the F-105 home from Vietnam night after night, the unglamorous Su-7 that Sukhoi's bureau had built out of a fatal crash and stubborn persistence was quietly proving in conflict after conflict around the globe. That the Soviet design philosophy had gotten something fundamentally right. The Su-7 never had the F-107's blistering top speed advantage or long range. It never carried sophisticated radar. It was, by almost every sophisticated performance metric American engineers valued, the less impressive machine on paper. But in the messy, unglamorous reality of actual combat, flown by pilots operating from rough forward airstrips, serviced by exhausted ground crews with limited tools, absorbing anti-aircraft fire on low-level strike runs, the Su-7's brutal simplicity turned out to be exactly the right answer to the wrong question everyone else had been asking. In the Middle East, in South Asia, in conflict after Cold War-era conflict where Soviet-aligned air forces flew it into combat, the Su-7 built a reputation as a jet that came home. Not gracefully, not always intact, but it came home again and again, absorbing damage that would have ended the mission, and possibly the pilot's life, in a more delicate airframe. Nearly 1/900 of them rolled off Soviet production lines, an enormous number for a Cold War-era fighter bomber, and they went on flying in frontline service, for decades after Western analysts assumed the design would be obsolete. There's a strange, uncomfortable irony sitting at the heart of this story, and it's worth saying out loud. The nation that prided itself on technological superiority, on out-engineering its rival at every turn, chose the aircraft with the bigger bomb bay and lost nearly half of them in the skies over Vietnam. The nation flying a crude, overbuilt, fuel-hungry jet with no fancy radar and a design philosophy built entirely around surviving mistakes, built one of the most enduring and successful fighter bombers of the entire Cold War. Toughness beat sophistication, simplicity beat elegance, and somewhere in a museum storage hangar, 3 American prototypes that could have outflown almost anything in the sky sat quietly rusting. Their story reduced to a footnote in aviation history books. Part 7. The what if that haunts aviation history. So here's the question that keeps this story alive. Decades after the last F-105 was retired and the last Su-7 rolled off a production line, what if America had never canceled the F-107? It's not an idle question. It's grounded in the aircraft's own performance numbers. The F-107 was smaller than the F-105, more agile, faster in acceleration, and by every account from the test pilots who actually flew it, a far more nimble dogfighter in a turning fight. Those are exactly the qualities that mattered most in the specific, brutal environment American pilots found themselves flying into over North Vietnam. Low-altitude strike runs against a defended target, followed by a scramble to survive contact with small, quick MiG interceptors that could turn inside almost anything else in the sky. Imagine an alternate version of that air war. Imagine American strike packages flying not the heavy, straight-line F-105 Thunderchief, but a fleet of nimble F-107 Ultra Sabres, jets capable of matching a MiG turn for turn, breaking away from surface-to-air missile launches with the kind of acceleration and agility the F-105 simply didn't have. Would the loss numbers have been different? Would fewer American pilots have ended up as prisoners of war in Hanoi, or names on a black granite wall in Washington that hadn't even been built yet when the F-107 program was canceled? Nobody can answer that with certainty. History doesn't run controlled experiments. Maybe the F-107's dorsal intake, the very feature that gave it such incredible performance, would have caused its own unique problems in the humid, punishing conditions of Southeast Asia. Maybe the Maneater nickname would have turned out to be more than just pilot superstition once the aircraft was flying real combat sorties instead of test flights over American deserts. We'll never know, because the Air Force never gave it the chance to find out. What we do know is this: the aircraft America chose instead, selected in part because of a larger bomb bay meant for a nuclear war that never happened, and in part because of the ordinary, unglamorous political gravity that keeps a defense contractor's factory lines running, ended up losing nearly half its production run in a jungle war. Nobody had planned for when the decision was made. And what we also know is this. On the other side of that same Cold War, a design bureau that had just watched its own prototype crash and kill a test pilot didn't get canceled. It got rebuilt, and it went on to become one of the most produced, most durable, and most quietly successful fighter bombers of the entire century. Not because it was the most advanced machine in the sky, but because it was built by people who assumed, correctly, that the real war would be messy, muddy, and unforgiving, and that the aircraft which survived that mess would matter more than the one that looked best on a spec sheet. So maybe that's the real question this story leaves behind, the one worth sitting with long after the video ends. When two superpowers raced to build the future of air combat, was the answer really the most brilliant machine humanity could engineer? Or was it, all along, the ugly, overbuilt, fuel-hungry beast that simply refused to die, the same brutal, indestructible philosophy that turned a failed Soviet prototype into a legend, while America's most promising fighter sat forgotten? Its story reduced to a nickname born from fear, the Maneater, killed not by an enemy pilot, but by a decision made in a room far from any runway, long before it ever got the chance to prove what it could really do. Part 8. A mission over Package 6, to understand exactly what those loss numbers meant in human terms. It helps to walk through a single mission, not one specific flight pulled from a history book, but a composite of the kind of mission F-105 crews flew, over and over, into the most heavily defended piece of airspace on the planet at that time. American aircrews had a nickname for it too. Route Package 6, the airspace surrounding Hanoi and Haiphong, thick with anti-aircraft guns, surface-to-air missile sites, and MiG bases within easy reach of any incoming strike package. A flight of F-105s takes off from a base in Thailand before dawn, heavily loaded with bombs. External fuel tanks slung under each wing to stretch their range toward the target. They rendezvous with tanker aircraft to top off fuel, then turn north, dropping low as they cross into North Vietnamese airspace to stay under enemy radar coverage for as long as possible. This is where the F-105 size starts to work against it. It is not a small aircraft. It does not disappear easily against a jungle backdrop, and it does not turn quickly enough to dodge what's about to come looking for it. Somewhere below, a North Vietnamese SAM operator watches a radar screen light up with an incoming formation. A missile battery, hidden under camouflage netting in a jungle clearing, prepares to fire. There is often no warning beyond a sudden call over the radio, SAM. SAM, break. As a telephone pole-sized missile rises out of the tree line on a trail of smoke, accelerating toward the formation at speeds that leave a pilot only seconds to react. A heavy jet like the F-105 has to work hard to outmaneuver that missile, rolling and diving in a desperate defensive break that a smaller, more agile aircraft could execute with far more margin for error. Some missions, the missile misses. Some missions, ground fire finds an engine or a fuel line instead. And a pilot who started the day in Thailand ends it parachuting into the jungle, becoming one of the hundreds of American airmen who spent years afterward as prisoners of war in Hanoi, or one of those who never came home at all. Multiply that single mission by hundreds of sorties, month after month, year after year, and the number starts to make grim sense. Nearly 400 F-105s lost, roughly half of everything Republic Aviation had ever built. It's not an abstraction. It's hundreds of individual missions like the one just described. Each one a roll of the dice against an enemy defense network the aircraft was never specifically designed to survive. Port 9. The beast goes to war again and again. While the F-105 was being ground down over North Vietnam, the Su-7 was earning its own combat reputation thousands of miles away, in conflicts that rarely made front-page headlines in the West, but mattered enormously to the air forces flying it. In the Middle East, Soviet-aligned air forces flew the Su-7 in the brutal, high-intensity air wars that defined the region during the 1960s and 1970s. These were not gentle training exercises. These were wars fought at low altitude, over open desert and contested airfields, against opponents flying some of the most capable Western fighters of the era. And time after time, squadron reports described the same pattern that had first emerged back in Soviet test programs. The Su-7 absorbed damage that should have ended a sortie and kept flying anyway. Ground fire tore through wings, shrapnel from anti-aircraft bursts peppered fuselages. And pilots, expecting to nurse a crippled aircraft toward the nearest friendly airfield for an emergency landing, instead found themselves flying home on an aircraft that simply refused to give up its structural integrity. Mechanics inspecting battle-damaged Su-7s after missions sometimes counted dozens of individual hits across a single airframe. Hits that, on a more delicately engineered Western jet, might have severed a hydraulic line, ignited a fuel tank, or simply torn a wing apart in mid-air. That same reputation followed the aircraft into South Asia, where it saw extensive combat over the Indian subcontinent, flying low-level strike and close air support missions in terrain and conditions every bit as unforgiving as the jungles of Southeast Asia. Again and again, the same story repeated itself. An unglamorous, fuel-hungry, radarless jet that Western analysts had once dismissed as crude kept coming home from missions that, by the numbers alone, it probably shouldn't have survived. By the time Sukhoi's design bureau wound down Su-7 production, having built close to 900 airframes, the aircraft had quietly amassed a combat record that outlasted and outperformed almost every Western assumption about what advanced was supposed to mean. It wasn't advanced, it was relentless, and in the specific ugly business of frontline air combat, relentless turned out to matter more. Part 10. Whatever happened to the three prototypes? There's something almost haunting about the fate of the F-107 program, once the cancellation or came down. 3 aircraft. That's the entire physical legacy of a jet that test pilots genuinely believed could outperform almost anything else flying at the time. One of the 3 prototypes was lost during the flight test program itself, a reminder that pushing any experimental aircraft to the edges of its performance envelope always carries risk, regardless of which country built it or which philosophy shaped its design. The remaining airframes lived on in a much quieter capacity after the Air Force's decision, used briefly for further research and testing before eventually being retired entirely, their combat career over before it had ever really begun. Today, what remains of the F-107 program exists mostly in museum collections, and the memories of the test pilots and engineers who worked on it, men who, decades later, still spoke about the aircraft's performance with a kind of wistful pride, and about that dorsal intake with a kind of dark humor that only makes sense once you understand exactly how close it sat to a pilot's head during an emergency ejection. It's a strange kind of legacy for a machine that outperformed its own eventual replacement in nearly every meaningful metric except one: the size of the bomb it could carry, for a war that never came, instead of the war that actually happened. Aviation history is full of aircraft that never got the chance to prove themselves in combat, but few of them carry quite this specific quiet tragedy: a jet fast enough and nimble enough to have possibly changed the arithmetic of an entire air war, sitting instead in storage, while a heavier, less agile aircraft absorbed losses that might have gone differently in its place. Part 11. A peton, not an accident. Here's the uncomfortable truth this story points toward. And it's bigger than just 2 aircraft. The F-107's cancellation wasn't a one-off mistake buried in the fog of Cold War procurement. It was an early example of a pattern that has repeated itself across American defense history again and again. A program gets canceled not because it failed technically, but because of factors that have nothing to do with performance in the air. Contractor relationships, congressional districts dependent on a factory's payroll, internal service politics, and short-term budget priorities that don't account for the kind of war a nation might actually end up fighting 5 or 10 years down the road. Defense planners in the late 1950s were, understandably, planning for the war they expected, a potential nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, fought with heavy bombers, carrying heavy payloads toward fixed strategic targets. Under that lens, The F-105's bigger bomb bay wasn't just a nice feature. It was arguably the single most important specification on the entire aircraft. Judged against the mission planners actually expected to fly, choosing the F-105 over the F-107 wasn't obviously wrong. It was a bet, made with the best information available at the time, on what the next war would look like. But wars have a well-documented habit of refusing to look like the ones militaries prepare for. The next major American air war wasn't fought over the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union, with strategic nuclear weapons. It was fought over triple canopy jungle, rice paddies, and mountain passes in Southeast Asia, against a numerically smaller but nimble and well-defended enemy air force, using conventional bombs dropped from low altitude under constant threat from missiles and anti-aircraft fire. It was, in almost every meaningful way, the exact opposite of the mission profile that had justified choosing the F-105 in the first place. That's the trap sitting at the heart of this story, and it's a trap that has caught military planners in nearly every era of history. You build the weapon for the war you expect. The enemy and history itself don't always cooperate. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side of the same era, a very different institutional culture, one less obsessed with immediate technological perfection and more focused on brute durability across a wide range of unpredictable combat scenarios, accidentally built an aircraft that turned out to be well suited for almost any kind of war it might be asked to fight. The Su-7 wasn't optimized for the specific mission Sukhoi's bureau originally imagined either. It simply happened to be tough enough, adaptable enough, and simple enough to succeed across a much wider range of conditions than anyone had planned for. Sometimes the machine that wins isn't the one engineered for a specific war. It's the one engineered to survive whatever war actually shows up. Closing. The question that never got answered, so we come back to where this story started, to a jet nicknamed the Maneater, feared by its own pilots, loved by test engineers, and killed before it ever fired a shot in anger. And to its rival across the world, an ugly, fuel-hungry, radarless beast born out of a fatal crash that went on to fly for decades and earn a reputation that outlasted almost every prediction made about it. Nearly 400 F-105 Thunderchiefs went down over Vietnam. That number sits at the center of this entire story, and no amount of what if can undo it. But it's still worth asking the question, because the question itself reveals something true about how militaries, and honestly, how any large organization, make decisions that echo for decades after the meeting where they were made has been forgotten. What if the aircraft chosen to fly into the most dangerous airspace in the world had been picked purely on the basis of which one gave a pilot the best chance to come home alive, rather than which one could carry a slightly bigger bomb toward a war that never happened? What if agility, acceleration, and maneuverability had outweighed payload capacity in a Pentagon planning room sometime in the late 1950s? Would 350, 400 American families have received a different phone call in the 1960s and early 1970s? Nobody can prove it. History doesn't run twice, but the numbers on both sides of this story are too stark to ignore. A jet built for a nuclear war that never came lost half its production run in a jungle war nobody predicted. A jet built to survive mud, mistakes, and abuse became one of the most produced fighter bombers of the entire Cold War, fighting in conflict after conflict, decade after decade, long after Western analysts assumed it would be obsolete. Maybe the real lesson buried inside this story isn't really about airplanes at all. Maybe it's about the danger of building for the war you expect, instead of the war you're actually going to get. Maybe it's about how the most brilliant piece of engineering in the room isn't always the one that survives contact with reality, and how the ugly, overbuilt, unglamorous machine that nobody's particularly proud of might be the one that quietly, stubbornly refuses to let its pilot die. 3 prototypes, nearly 2,000 production aircraft, one question that's been sitting unanswered in aviation history for over 60 years. What was America actually looking for when it sent its pilots into the most dangerous skies of the Cold War? The most brilliant machine humanity could build, or the one ugly enough, tough enough, and stubborn enough to bring them home? Epilogue. The men flew it anyway. Before the credits roll on this story, it's worth pausing on something easy to lose in a narrative about airframes: intake designs and procurement politics. The men who strapped into that heavy, embattled F-105 every single day, fully aware of the odds stacked against them, and flew the mission anyway. Whatever the aircraft's shortcomings against the specific threat environment of North Vietnam, the pilots who flew the Thunderchief were not victims of a bad machine in any simple sense. They were professionals executing an extraordinarily dangerous job with skill, discipline, and a level of courage that deserves its own recognition, separate from any argument about whether a different aircraft might have changed the odds. Many of them flew mission after mission into Route Package 6 long after they understood exactly how lethal that airspace had become, because the mission required it and their squadron mates were counting on them. Some of those pilots spent years as prisoners of war after being shot down, enduring conditions in North Vietnamese captivity that remain some of the darkest chapters of the entire conflict. Others flew their full combat tours and came home, carrying with them a level of first-hand knowledge about the F-105's strengths and weaknesses that no engineering report could ever fully capture. And some, of course, never came home at all. This story isn't really about blaming an aircraft, or even about blaming the decision-makers who chose it over a faster, more agile alternative back in the 1950s, working with the best information they had at the time about the war they expected to fight. It's about understanding how a chain of individually reasonable decisions, a bomb bay sized for a strategic mission, a contractor relationship worth protecting, a doctrine built around a war that never arrived, can combine, years later, into an outcome that costs real people their lives in a war nobody at that original decision table had even imagined yet. That's the weight sitting underneath every technical detail in this story. The intake placement, the fuel capacity, the cannon caliber, the production numbers. Behind every one of those specifications was a human being climbing into a cockpit, trusting that the machine underneath him had been built by people who understood the war he was actually about to fly into. Sometimes it had been. Sometimes, as this story shows, it hadn't, and the men flying it paid the difference themselves. One mission at a time, one act of courage at a time, in skies that neither aircraft's designers had ever quite planned for.